Hi, everybody. So now we begin this experiment with taking this course online. I've used this software before to make these little mini videos, and I'm hoping that it will be at least a little bit better than showing me speaking to you in a video. This is based on the PowerPoint that I've developed for this introduction to the quest for meaning. In our previous unit, which was the quest for form, we were looking at all the innovative forms that artists, both literary artists and visual artists and musical artists, used. And we did ask the question about, well, why all this change? And we talked about things like, well, the World War I had a really big impact on people being disillusioned with values and forms that were used in the past. We also talked about innovations like photography affecting visual artists in particular. But we want to come back to this question about why the drastic shift, because it was not just World War I. That was not the whole thing. There actually had been over the previous couple of centuries an evolution of thinking that that becomes very apparent. So we're going to talk about philosophers and other thinkers who began to question the world in a very significant and fundamental way. We really kind of need to go back to the Renaissance to see how over the course of time people in the world learned new things about the universe that overturned beliefs they previously had and the values that were constructed from those beliefs as well. Copernicus, for example, discovered that it was not the Earth but the Sun that was at the center, not of the universe, but of at least of the center of the solar system. So it wasn't that other things revolved around the Earth, which was seen as central. Science, had been dead wrong for centuries, and since science reflected human knowledge, people found out that they lived on one not so important planet among many others in a vast universe. Earth was not, after all, the heart of creation. This was a discovery that deflated the image of humanity as the center of God's creation. More discoveries were made, and people began to question more and more the traditions and conventions that had been meaningful in the past. Thinkers like Descartes and Hume, and unintentionally even Kant, questioned more and more fundamentally the possibility of knowing anything concretely about human existence and the reason for our being here. In the 19th century, there were a series of discoveries and theories, new ways of looking at the world that for many intellectuals and artists led to more serious and disturbing doubts about the meaning of life and the role of human beings in it. There are four thinkers of the 19th century that really set the stage for the rise of modernism in the arts. And I usually refer to these guys as the Big Four. Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, which established his theory of evolution and thus began the controversy that is still very much alive today. The main idea of his theory is, in the world, more offspring are produced than can survive, than there's food for, and therefore there's competition for survival. Those who are best suited adapt to their environment, and they survive at a higher rate. This is the basis for the idea that species evolve from lower forms as they undergo modifications and mutations in this struggle for survival. Through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the established order consisted of an aristocracy which was in their own view destined to rule the masses. I don't know if you've heard of something called the divine right of kings, but it was a concept in which it is believed that if a king exists in a particular country, that God must have willed that to be, and so no one has the right to question that person. There's also something called the Great Chain of Being, in which there's this whole hierarchy of the universe where God is at the top, angels just below there, human beings just below there, and then the animal kingdom in various stages. Everything was as it should be. Marx, however, wrote that history is not preordained from above, but was a continuous class struggle in which existing powers maintained and defended control and oppressed the subservient classes through the economic and political powers they reserved for themselves. Communism, Marxism, has never taken hold in America very much, so its influence is kind of hard to understand here. But nevertheless, it played a very large role in the transformation of Western ideas and politics, even in the rise of democracy. It is impossible to put Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy in a nutshell, but it was Nietzsche who made the famous, or rather infamous, announcement in one of his philosophical texts that, quote, God is dead. This is a rather misunderstood statement, as Nietzsche made this statement through a character he created in this book that he refers to as the madman. And he not just says, God is dead, but he says, we have killed him. We have eliminated our need for him. So it's a context that really needs more of an explanation, but he's the one who made this claim. But basically, Nietzsche claimed that objective knowledge that could be claimed as absolute, is in the human condition simply impossible and inaccessible. The meaning of life cannot then be determined by us as long as we are in the world. All values and conventions, everything that we have maintained as being beyond doubt, whether it's truth or God or human rights, moral behavior, everything, have been founded on belief, not on any kind of absolute. Our values were created by people and were mere conventions without any metaphysical validity. These values then had no true worth of their own. This is a difficult dilemma. Where does that leave us? For Nietzsche, each individual had in the end to determine value for him or herself, accepted as a responsibility, but also as a creative activity. And in this way, Nietzsche anticipates the concept of existentialism, which has similar emphasis on the responsibility for us to take, to make value for ourselves. Sigmund Freud's importance lies in his discovery of a totally new and uncharted world, the subconscious. Earlier, humanity's belief in its superiority to animals was due to its superior reason. Freud asserted that all of our conscious decisions were made as a result of subconscious drives, which were made up of rather dark and unflattering elements of our minds. You might recognize some of the terms, or you might have learned about some of these terms. The id, the ego, the superego were motivated by a libido or survival instinct. What else do we know about Freud? You probably have heard of things like the Oedipus complex, of concepts of like repression and suppression and sublimation, and something as unflattering as castration anxiety. So this idea of reason is kind of undermined by this sense of we are ruled by our drives. The traditional hierarchy of the universe, and with it the values it asserted as fundamental to civilization, placed humankind just below the angels. Intellectual trends in the early 20th century, however, turned all this around and declared not only that God was dead, but that humanity had evolved from apes, and, moreover, that we secretly desired to kill our fathers and sleep with our mothers. No wonder the 20th century is such a downer. This, of course, is an oversimplification of the period. It's not as plain as all this, but these trends did make the 20th century a drastically different period in history. And if the 20th century comes across as a downer, it is because when we look at the least common denominator about life, we find death. That we will all die sometimes is our only certainty. At the same time, human beings are different than other animals because we can anticipate the future, project ourselves into the future. We have things like memory, okay? So thus we can think about our own deaths, projecting ourselves into the future. The philosopher Martin Heidegger dwelt really heavily on this idea of our ability to anticipate the future. But the certainty of our death, combined with the uncertainty of what lies beyond it, motivates the kind of literature and art that we have been studying in this period. So it is an anxious, troubled period.